There are places on this planet where the evidence refuses to behave the way science expects it to behave, where the data that comes back from instruments and the observations reported by the people who descend into darkness and cold to look with their own eyes simply will not resolve into any of the categories that established knowledge has prepared for them. These are uncomfortable places for science, because science operates on the assumption that everything has an explanation that fits within the existing framework of natural law, and that the job of investigation is simply to find the right explanation rather than to question whether the framework itself is adequate. The Baltic Sea anomaly, discovered in the cold depths beneath one of the world's most historically significant bodies of water, has spent more than a decade being exactly that kind of uncomfortable place. Every time researchers have approached it with a theory that seemed reasonable and well-supported, the evidence has pushed back. Every time a scientific consensus has appeared to be forming around a particular explanation, a new detail has emerged that the consensus could not accommodate. And when experts finally assembled everything that had been learned through years of expeditions, laboratory analysis, and deep-sea investigation, what they concluded was not the comfortable geological explanation that institutions had been quietly hoping for. The truth, as it emerged from the full weight of the evidence, was considerably more shocking than anyone who had been following the story from a distance had been prepared to receive. The discovery itself happened in June 2011, when two Swedish explorers named Peter Lindberg and Dennis Asperg were conducting a sonar survey of the Baltic seabed in the area between Sweden and Finland. Lindberg and Asperg were experienced treasure hunters, people who had spent years scanning the floors of various bodies of water, looking for shipwrecks and historical artifacts, and they brought to their work the kind of calibrated expectation that comes from having seen many unusual sonar readings that eventually resolved into perfectly ordinary sunken vessels or rock formations. What their equipment returned on this particular occasion did not resolve into anything ordinary. The sonar image showed a massive circular object resting on the seafloor at a depth of approximately 90 meters, measuring roughly 60 meters across. The shape was disc-like, with edges that appeared sharper and more geometrically regular than any natural formation either of them had previously encountered in their years of underwater surveying. The thing that elevated the reading from unusual to genuinely alarming was what appeared behind it, stretching back from the object across the seafloor for almost 300 meters, a trench of extraordinary straightness and regularity, as though something enormous had been moving at considerable speed and had come to an abrupt halt, gouging a perfectly linear scar into the seabed in the process. The initial reactions within the team ranged from excited to uneasy, which is a telling combination. In their collective experience, exciting sonar readings were common enough. Readings that produced unease were rarer, and the unease was usually the more reliable indicator that something genuinely outside normal experience was being observed. The object's characteristics as visible in the sonar data were deeply inconsistent with the natural and historical inventory of things that end up on the Baltic seafloor. The Baltic Sea is rich in shipwrecks from various historical periods, and experienced sonar operators know what those look like in the data. They also know what natural rock formations look like, what glacial deposits look like, what the various categories of ordinary underwater geology produce when scanned with the kind of equipment Lindberg and Asperg were using. None of those categories fit what the sonar was showing them. The disc shape was too regular. The edges were too sharp. The trench behind it was too straight and too long. The combination of those features did not correspond to anything in the established inventory of Baltic seafloor phenomena. When the team returned to the site for more detailed investigation, they encountered something that transformed the discovery from a puzzling sonar anomaly into something that demanded a fundamentally different category of explanation. Every piece of electronic equipment on their vessel began to malfunction the moment they brought the ship within approximately 200 meters of the object's position. This did not happen gradually or inconsistently. It happened with a specificity that eliminated any reasonable interpretation based on equipment failure or environmental interference of the kind normally encountered in marine operations. Satellite phones lost signal completely. Navigation instruments failed. Sonar screens filled with static. Communication equipment went silent. When the vessel moved back beyond the 200-meter boundary, all the equipment returned to full function immediately, as though nothing had happened. The crew repeated this approach multiple times, and the result was identical every time. Within 200 meters, everything stopped working. Beyond 200 meters, everything worked perfectly. The boundary was not approximate or fuzzy. It was precise. The crew began calling the area within that invisible perimeter the dead zone, a name that captured both the practical reality of what happened to their technology there and the deeper sense of wrongness that the phenomenon produced. Members of the expedition later described the experience of approaching that boundary as producing a feeling that was difficult to articulate in scientific terms, but that every person on the vessel felt independently, a sense that they were approaching something that was aware of their presence and was actively resisting observation. The language of instinct and intuition is not the language of scientific investigation, and the researchers involved were careful to distinguish between what their instruments were telling them and what their gut reactions were producing. But the consistency with which every person on the vessel reported the same subjective experience in the dead zone added a dimension to the investigation that purely instrument-based analysis could not capture. The decision to send divers down to make direct visual contact with the object was not taken lightly. At 90 meters below the surface, the water temperature was just above freezing, hovering around 2 degrees Celsius. The pressure at that depth is intense. The darkness is total, and the margin for error in dive operations is measured in seconds rather than minutes. The dive team was led by experienced underwater investigator Stefan Hogeborn, whose professional record included deep water investigations in conditions that would have been prohibitive for less experienced divers. What Hogeborn and his team encountered when their lights finally cut through the black water and reached the surface of the object was something that none of them had prepared themselves for, regardless of how carefully they had tried to manage their expectations going in. The surface beneath their hands was hard in a way that exceeded the hardness of ordinary rock. The material did not crumble or flake under pressure. It was dense and rigid and smooth in places in a way that ordinary stone on the seafloor simply is not. Because ordinary stone on the seafloor has been subject to centuries or millennia of biological colonization, sediment accumulation, and chemical weathering that invariably produces a textured, encrusted surface. Parts of the object's surface were marked with dark patches and fine networks of cracks that the divers described as resembling material that had been subjected to extreme heat and then cooled very suddenly, like ceramic that has been fired at temperatures far beyond its design tolerance. But the feature that stopped the divers and forced them to question everything they thought they were going to find was the geometry. Rising from the seafloor was a wall that was vertical, precisely vertical, meeting the seafloor at a 90-degree angle with sharpness that erosion and geological process simply do not produce. And the corridors formed by intersecting walls met each other at right angles with the same impossible precision, creating a spatial geometry that was not the geometry of nature, but the geometry of engineering. At the top of the structure, Hogeborn's flashlight illuminated what appeared to be a circular opening set within a raised rectangular frame. The circle within the square, two of the most fundamental forms in human geometric thinking. Sitting at the apex of a structure 90 meters beneath the surface of the Baltic Sea, Hogeborn pressed his gloved hand against the frame of this circular opening and felt the same extreme hardness, the same scorched, dense quality that the rest of the surface had produced. His eyes and his hands were sending him incompatible messages, the way a person feels incompatible messages when they encounter something that should not exist in the place where they are finding it. The material said ancient geological formation. The geometry said something else entirely. The rock samples that were extracted from the object and brought back to the surface for laboratory analysis at Stockholm University produced results that deepened the contradiction rather than resolving it. The geologist Volker Bruchert, who examined the samples under microscopes and subjected them to detailed compositional analysis, confirmed that the material was basalt, a volcanic igneous rock formed from molten lava that cools rapidly. This confirmation created an immediate and serious geological problem. The Baltic Sea rests on one of the most geologically stable continental foundations on Earth, an ancient shield formation that has not experienced significant volcanic activity for tens of millions of years. There are no volcanoes in the region. There are no magma chambers beneath the Baltic seafloor. There are no volcanic vents, no thermal sources, no geological mechanisms of any kind that could produce basalt in this location through any natural process that current geological science recognizes. Finding basalt on the Baltic seafloor is, in the words of scientists who reviewed the findings, comparable to finding a tropical reef in a desert. The material had no natural business being there. The crystal structure of the basalt itself, examined at the microscopic level, added another layer of impossibility to the picture. The rock showed evidence of having been subjected to extreme temperatures in the range of thousands of degrees Celsius, followed by extremely rapid cooling, a thermal history consistent with either a man-made high-temperature industrial process or the conditions experienced by a solid object entering the Earth's atmosphere from space at high velocity. This thermal signature was inconsistent with normal geological basalt formation, which involves a slower cooling process, and does not produce the kind of crystal stress patterns that the Baltic samples displayed. The material had been through something violent and sudden, something that standard geological processes in the Baltic region could not account for. The meteorite impact hypothesis was considered seriously by researchers who were looking for a natural explanation that could account for the basalt's presence and its unusual thermal history. A large space rock striking the seabed at sufficient velocity could theoretically generate the temperatures needed to produce basalt-like material from the shock of impact and the heat of entry. It was a scientifically respectable proposal, and it had the considerable advantage of being a natural explanation that did not require revising fundamental assumptions about the history of human technological capability or the possibility of non-human intelligence. The problem was the geometry. Meteorite impacts do not produce vertical walls. They do not produce corridors meeting at right angles. They do not produce circular openings set within raised rectangular frames. The physical destruction produced by a meteorite strike is chaotic and radiating, shattering and vitrifying everything within its radius into irregular, glassy fragments. Nothing survives an impact zone in neat, engineered shapes. The geometry of the Baltic anomaly was categorically incompatible with any impact scenario that physics could construct. This left researchers in a position that the scientific community finds genuinely uncomfortable, confronted with evidence that does not fit the available natural explanations and that points, however reluctantly, toward alternatives that the mainstream of scientific thought has not developed adequate frameworks for evaluating. The combination of anomalous material in an impossible location, extreme thermal history inconsistent with local geology, electronic interference of a type and magnitude that passive mineral deposits cannot produce, and geometric regularity that natural erosion and geological formation cannot create, taken together, demanded an explanation that transcended the categories of conventional Baltic Sea geology. Some researchers who have spent years studying the site and its evidence have arrived at a concept that they describe as the corpse of technology, a phrase that captures the central paradox of the Baltic anomaly with considerable precision. The idea is that what appears now as a stone formation might be the dramatically altered remains of something that was once engineered, an object whose original materials were subjected to conditions so extreme that they underwent complete molecular transformation, converting whatever the original substance was into basalt while preserving, in the overall structure, the geometric characteristics of the thing that was originally built. This is not an explanation that sits comfortably within mainstream geological discourse, because it requires accepting that something was built in the Baltic region at some point in the past with materials and capabilities that do not appear in any human historical record, and that the evidence of that construction survived in mineralized form through whatever catastrophic event produced the thermal signatures now visible in the crystal structure of the rock. The trench that extends behind the object for nearly 300 meters has its own contribution to make to this picture. Geologist Bruchert was explicit in his assessment that no known glacial mechanism could have produced a trench of this straightness and this depth across the Baltic seafloor, and that the absence of the sedimentary smoothing that should have obscured any such feature over centuries of active seafloor conditions was in itself deeply anomalous. The trench looks, in the words of people who have studied the sonar data closely, like a runway, like the scar left by something enormous and fast-moving that came to a sudden stop, displacing material to either side in the clean ridges that border the trench and ending at the circular object that sits at its terminus. The straightness of the path and the violence implied by the depth of the displacement tell a story of something moving with purpose and stopping with catastrophic force, and the fact that the evidence of that stopping had persisted with such fidelity against the active erosional processes of the Baltic seafloor suggests that whatever the object is, it is extraordinarily dense and heavy, pressing into the seabed with a weight that the normal processes of sediment movement and current activity have been unable to disturb across however long it has been sitting there. What the experts who have assembled all of this evidence into a coherent picture have ultimately concluded is that the Baltic Sea anomaly represents a category of evidence that current science is not fully equipped to evaluate, not because the science is incompetent, but because the thing being examined appears to fall outside the range of phenomena for which science has developed its tools. Whether the object represents the remains of a technology produced by a human civilization that predates the historical record by a significant margin, or whether it represents something whose origin is not terrestrial in any sense, is a question that the available evidence does not definitively answer. What the evidence does answer, clearly and repeatedly and across multiple independent lines of investigation, is that the conventional explanations, the glacial deposit theory, the natural volcanic formation theory, the ordinary shipwreck theory, are all inadequate. The Baltic Sea anomaly is not any of those things. It is something that the categories available to current science cannot comfortably contain, and the process of determining exactly what it is has only barely begun despite more than a decade of investigation. The cold water of the Baltic continues to hold its secret, and the object at the end of that 300-meter trench continues to shut down the electronics of anyone who approaches within 200 meters, indifferent to the years of effort that human curiosity has directed at it, waiting with whatever patience ancient and inexplicable things possess for a question that is finally the right one.